Akira.
The Dawn.
He's got clout.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for the delay. I hope this is all working. Hopefully, I'm up to this. I'm learning how to manage this, I think. I'm not really interested, I suppose, in slowing down, although it has been a bit much in the last year and a half. I do better in some ways when I'm working flat out. So, yeah, I thought about slowing, but I've decided against it. There are times in your life where it's not time to slow down, it's time to become more efficient. That's the thing, you can become so efficient. You end up doing things in 5 minutes that would otherwise take you a week. As you take on more responsibilities and you determine that you're going to become more efficient, the responsibility pushes the efficiency. What do they say too? There's time enough to sleep when you're in the grave.
Analysis of the purpose of memory. People think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. Lessons to structure the future. So you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. Done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. Done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. Done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, it's really obsessing you. If you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. Memory has a very pragmatic function, and cultural memory is the same thing. We need to extract out stories from our past that structure our future. And we need that because, well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering. Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. Is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. A noble and worthwhile purpose. Hopefully, your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead. They're done. They don't have a story anymore. They don't have a call to adventure. And then, well, then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. Bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story. and then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. People think of freedom as the ability to implement your whim. And freedom opens up that as a possibility. But sustainable freedom, that isn't what it's about at all. It's primarily about responsibility. It's about determining which load you're going to pick up and carry. That's the proper definition of appropriate freedom. It's not dim gratification of instantaneous impulse. It's self-evident that that doesn't work. 2-year-olds do that. And that's why they can't live in the world. They can't organize themselves across time. They can't sacrifice the moment for the future. And the more sophisticated you get, I suppose, in some sense, the more you're able to do that. And then your freedom becomes the freedom to choose the proper responsibility. That's also not something that we've been good at communicating to young people. If we talk to them about responsibility, we generally do it in a finger-wagging sort of way. It's like, well, you're breaking the rules, you're a bad person. And well, that may be true, but the proper message for young people is to say, well, no, you don't understand. You want to take on responsibility. You want to take on the heaviest load that you can conceive of, that you might be able to move, because it gives your life nobility and purpose. And that offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy, offsets the tragedy. And not only psychologically, because you have a purpose and something to wake up for, to face the difficulties of the day, but also because if you face the difficulties of the day properly, you actually ameliorate suffering, not only in the psychological sense, but because you make the world at least a less terrible place. And that's something. And that's something. Right, to move things away from hell is something. To move things away from the worst they can be is, well, that's a noble goal in and of itself.
There's a lot of really good things going on in the world. We have poverty, absolute poverty. Between the year 2000 and 2012, hundreds of thousands of people are being connected to the power grid every day. Fresh water is available not to fewer and fewer people, but to more and more people. That's happening extremely rapidly. Starvation in India and China is a thing completely of the past. You never hear about that. And that's pretty much the case for the rest of the world, except now and then for political reasons. You know, everybody's got a cell phone, and anybody who doesn't is going to have one in the next 10 years. And that puts in people's hands a degree of communication and access that would have been absolutely incomprehensible even 15 years ago. All these good things are happening. And just concentrating on this polarization process that seems to have gripped us in the West seems counterproductive given all those good things that are going on in the background. Now, that doesn't make what's going on in the West trivial, but it does set it inside a much more positive context, so that's something to keep in mind.
Freedom of speech, the right to freedom of speech is central because it's the right by which you defend all the other rights. Well, that's why the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept. Christ, think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. This is independent of any religious discussion or any historical accuracy. It doesn't matter. What Christ represents is the perfect individual. Whatever that is. Now, you discuss endlessly what that is, but one of the things the West has settled on is that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. Does that through truth. That's embedded in the first few sentences of Genesis, for example. God brings the world into being. And the idea that That truthful speech that brings the world into being from formless potential also characterizes each person. That's our fabrication in the image of God. That's the idea of the West. It's an unbelievably remarkable idea that perfection, individual perfection, is to be found in the relationship with spoken truth. God, that's the great idea. Well, it's out of that arises the observation that there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights and obligations as well, let's say, than freedom of speech. Yes, it's absolutely central. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh. The idea is that the perfect individual is the person who speaks truth, but also acts out the truth of those words. It's a proposition whose merit is virtually self-evident when you understand it in that manner. So yeah, to see assaults on freedom of speech, especially compelled speech, well, that's where I drew the line in my life. It's like, that is the West. It's logocentric. If you want to take the West down, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of the society. So you have to do that. It's like, and this is the level at which this war is being fought. It's fundamentally a theological war.
Question?
I'm married young and have had only one sexual partner. Now I desire variety, but value my marriage and will not cheat. Any insight on overcoming this conflict? As a matter of fact, yes, I would say get the variety with your partner. You know, there's lots of games you can play to spice up your sexual life. Buy some lingerie, like buy 100 pieces. You know, buy whatever you need that you might want to experiment with. You have to introduce that spirit of pretend play that you had when you were a little kid into your sexual life, and then you have many partners in the same person. Put some thought into it. Sex is a domain in which expertise can be developed just like any other domain. Some of that's play and fantasy play, some of it's sexual technique. And I guess then the other thing I would say is take stock of each other and see if there are things that you could do in your life that would make you more attractive to one another. You know, those are hard questions because no one wants to say, well, you know, I'd be more attracted to my wife sexually if she just acted X way. And the same with regards to a wife's contemplation of her husband, but those are the real questions, man. If your partner isn't acting in a manner that is sexually attractive, then either there's something wrong with you or there's something wrong with them. Those harsh judgments that your sexual attraction makes are also very useful ways of orienting yourself towards proper behavior in the world. Admit to the variety that you want and see to what degree you can fulfill that within the confines of the marriage. It's also part of